today is going to be choosing the right system. So this basically comes into play when if you're maybe the owner of a venue, or if you're the AV person at a venue and you're the one making the decisions as to what console they would buy, or if you're upgrading, what console would you choose? Or maybe you're just an installer and you go to different clients and they have questions, which mixer should I go with? They're deferring to you for your expertise. So after you go through this class, you should have enough of an idea of the Allen and Heath range and what's the right system to choose for each client. You're probably not going to be able to choose a very specific model and say, okay, I definitively know this is exactly the right one for this person. Usually it's going to be kind of a range. And then at the end, you factor in certain other variables and you say, okay, now we can really narrow down specifically which one it is. But at the end of this, you should be able to kind of pick a range and eliminate consoles that are not a good fit for that client. So I'm going to be saying it, I'm going to say client a lot, like as if you're an installer, but you might, of course, just be an individual looking to purchase a new system. But just keep that in mind. So the first step, I'm going to disable annotations because somebody's drawing on my screen. Hang on. Okay, so the first step is asking the right question. So when you have a client that says, hey, I need a new system, there should be some initial questions that you have. And these are the questions that I generally ask when somebody's kind of completely unsure of which Allen and Heath system to go with. These are the questions that I start out with to start eliminating different possibilities and kind of target in on which console is the best suited for them. So the first thing I would ask is the max number of input channels the client anticipates using. And just to clear up a couple of the terms here, so we're talking about the maximum number. So this is not, there might be a church that, during their weekly services, they have maybe, 5 or 10 people on stage, but then they have a big Christmas pageant and it jumps up to, 36 people and they need much higher input count than they would normally. So you want to make sure that you're accounting for that, the fact that their system might need to grow, during specific times of the year, or in general, maybe they're just like a growing venue and they're constantly expanding and they need to future-proof themselves in the case that they eventually outgrow the mixer that you're assigned to them. So you want to give someone room to grow within the system and make sure that they won't completely max out during those heavy seasons. And keep in mind, it's input channels to mix. So we're not talking about input sockets. If you've seen my previous masterclass on terminology, we're not talking about just like XLR inputs, because you can have an SQ with like hundreds of XLR inputs all over the place, but an SQ really only has 48 input channels that you can mix simultaneously. So that's what we're asking, is how many input channels do you anticipate ever using simultaneously? What's the maximum number that you would use? Next, the max number of independent mixes required. So we're talking about the mains, we're talking about auxes for monitors, we're talking about groups if the person anticipates using subgroups for drums or background vocals, and then matrices if they need to do distributed audio, and we'll go more in depth on that later. Next, the number of mix positions. So what I mean by this is how many different locations can somebody have access to the system to make adjustments? Basically, how many places can somebody kind of log in? This could be in a console, or this could mean an iPad, or it could mean like an instance of like Director or SQ Mixpad on a computer, or it could mean an IP controller. And we'll look at the capabilities of each of these systems and how they can be expanded to have more mix positions. But you have to anticipate that from the client. If they say, oh, we just have like one person who stands in the back and mixes, and that's all we'll ever need, we're just mixing for the room, then that's fine. You could just take a console that is not expandable in that regard. But if they say, hey, we need a broadcast mix, and we need a stream mix, and we need a monitor mix, and we need somebody to be there making adjustments all the time, then you have to factor that into your decision. Number of faders accessible simultaneously. So this is not the total amount of faders that a console has, because we know with digital consoles, you can page through and there's different banks, but sometimes that's not good enough for certain people. They want to be able to see all the channels. And again, we're going to look at that more in depth later. Third-party integration, so they might need to talk to other gear that they have that uses Dante or Waves or MADI. So you have to have a console that, if they do have that external gear, you have to have a console that could speak that language. Skill level of a typical user, for example, is it a church where the people using the console are generally volunteers and they don't know a lot of the background on audio and they're just kind of doing this for fun on the side? Or is it going to be a professional level user who's really going to go in depth in all the settings and really make use of the console? You don't want to have someone who's kind of overwhelmed with too many options, but at the same time, you don't want it to be limiting to someone who can make use of all those options. And special feature requirements. So, the difference between like Avantis and DLive, the big difference is usually kind of channel count and some like the different hardware flexibility, but there's also kind of very like little niche features that some consoles have and some don't. So you have to make sure that you're picking one if they have special requirements that meets those requirements. And lastly, of course, budget and availability. I'm not going to go into pricing too much in this course, but those are, of course, final considerations. But I'm more focused on the technical side of things. I like to kind of establish technically where they're at and what they need, and then we could work with the budget and what's currently available, because something might be very much in demand and you can't get it in time, whereas they might have urgent needs where they need something by next month. So the next step is, once you have the answers to those questions, is narrowing down your options. And so don't think of this as, okay, we have the answers now, we could pick, we know this console specifically is the one that they need. Think of it more as eliminating options that would not work. So if we're talking about the input channels, the first question that I mentioned on the previous slide, the max number of input channels a client anticipates using, this is kind of the range that's available to each of these series of consoles. So if it's less than 16, then Z or Q are probably appropriate. If it's 16 to 32, then Q or SQ probably. But again, think of this more as a limiting console. So if somebody says, hey, I need 40 input channels, then it's probably a Q is probably not the right fit, because the Q32 maxes out at 32 mono channels and 3 stereo channels. You're really pushing the total channel count, and you want to leave room for growth in the future. So think of this as kind of eliminating consoles that would not fit because they don't meet the input channel requirements. And of course, AHM series can go up to, with the AHM 64, you can go up to 64 input channels. So you want to make sure that you think about AHM as well. If it's not necessarily a situation where you're mixing like musical stuff, it's just kind of simple adjustments of level and dry microphones, then AHM series can also apply in a lot of these cases. So think about AHM as well. And then, like if somebody says, hey, I need, 65 input channels, you can already eliminate everything Avantis and down, because Avantis maxes out at 64. And so that really narrows you down to DLive. Next, the max number of independent mixes. So we're talking about the mains, we're talking about, do they need monitors on stage? Do they have a sub? Is that sub going to use just kind of the mains with a crossover, or is it a specially tailored mix? Do they have a stream mix? Do they have to send audio to a lobby or a cry room in the church, et cetera? So there's all kinds of different possibilities in terms of what they need for mixes within the console. And so you could see, when I said max mixes, this is not the total amount of buses within the console. We're talking about the actual independent mixes where you can actually adjust the relative level of channels. So this is mainly the mains and auxes. A matrix can be useful for kind of audio distribution, but keep in mind that a matrix is usually just kind of a copy of another mix. So like if you have the mains and then a matrix going to the lobby, and then the people in the lobby say, hey, I can't hear the lead vocalist very well, you can't turn up just the lead vocalist in the lobby. You have to turn it up in the main mix in order for it to make that change. So what I'm talking about here are mainly kind of the mains and auxes. So with a Q, you don't have a very flexible bus configuration. You have the mains, you have 4 mono mixes, and then you have, if you set all your groups to operate in mix mode, then you can have up to 7 stereo mixes. So that's still a lot, and that could still satisfy a lot of customers. But if you do need more than that, you know that you have to eliminate Q. So if somebody says, hey, I need 10 stereo mixes for my band, then you know that Q is not the right choice, because you can only do up to 7 stereo auxes on stage. So that's when you start looking at SQ. With Avantis, DLive, and AHM, notice it says flex because in those consoles, you just have a total amount of buses within the console, and you could assign those as you wish to your mains, to your auxes, to your groups, to your matrices, to your effects buses. So with Avantis, DLive, AHM, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of allocation. With SQ, you have your mains, and then you have 12 mixes that can be either mono or stereo, and they can each be auxes or groups, depending on your needs. So keep in mind, those are the capabilities of each of those consoles for independent mixes. Next, narrowing down options. So the number of mix positions. So remember, this is like places where people actually have access to make adjustments to the mix. And so yeah, front of house, monitors, broadcast, those are 3 examples, but there could be other ones. And also portability. If a church says, hey, we usually are in this sanctuary, but sometimes we do these cool concerts in the summer out in the parking lot. And so in that case, you might not want to give them a big DLive S7000 that's not very portable. You might want to give them another option where they have a smaller console that they could bring out to the parking lot. So portability is a consideration as well when you're talking about mixed positions. And so these are all the different options for each of the consoles. So with a Q, you can mix on the console itself. You could do a digital split over to an SQ that adds another mix position. You can add an iPad, that's another mix position, but it's not as expandable as the other series, as you can see. So SQ, you can expand over the S-Link port or an IO port to another console. You can add a tablet, you have a computer editor, and those can all add mix positions with a tablet or a computer that don't necessarily need to add another console to it. So you can have an SQ where the front of house mixer is actually at the console, and then somebody else is mixing on a computer and they're mixing just for a stream mix. So that's adding another mix position without adding another console. Sometimes adding another mix position requires adding another console, and sometimes it could just be done with a computer or an IP controller or a tablet. And so depending on their needs and depending on the channel count, like if somebody's okay with using the same input channels for both your aux sends to monitors and to the mains, then you don't need to duplicate all those channels. But with the DLive, you might have room to duplicate all of your input channels within the console and have some that are dedicated for aux sends and some that are dedicated for the mains. So it's really a matter of nailing down exactly what the client needs. Do they want to EQ the aux channel separately from the main channels? If so, you need to duplicate them or add a separate monitor mixer. Are there any questions so far? Sorry, I think I've been going too fast. If anyone has a question, just don't be shy, put it in the chat or unmute yourself, that's fine. Okay, next step is, so max number of faders accessible simultaneously. So let's go more in depth on this. So like I said, it depends on the preference of the user. Some people are okay with a compact console and banking through layers, and it often also depends on the skill level of the user. So if somebody's really inexperienced in audio, it might completely throw them off if there's certain channels that they can't see all the time. So if you have like 16 channels and some of them are visible and some of them you have to bank down and find, that can completely mess somebody up if they're not too familiar with digital consoles. So keep that in mind. If somebody's not very skilled with digital consoles, they're coming from analog worlds where every channel was always visible, then that might take some getting used to. It might take some training in advance, or you just might want to choose a console that actually has all the faders laid out for them. There's like Carla Morrison is right now on tour with a great engineer named Jerry Lopez, and he mixes this tour with a CTI 1500 with 12 faders, and he's okay with that on a major tour because he's so familiar with the console, he's familiar with the band. It's a lot of the same performances over and over again. So in that case, a small number of faders, 12 faders for 128 channels, that's fine. But for others, that might not be the case. And so these are kind of the max amount of faders you can have per console series. So with Q, you can have, if it's a Q32, you have 32 faders plus a master. With SQ, if you go with an SQ7, it's 32 plus a master. Avantis is always 24, but you can add IP controllers like an IP8 to get additional faders. DLive, the S7000 has 36 faders, plus you can add IP controllers as well. And AHM doesn't have any faders on the device itself, so you'd probably need IP controllers if you wanted physical faders for them to use. Dayton, is there an S4000 model? No, there isn't. Yeah, interesting question. I don't know exactly how they came to that naming scheme, but there's 3,000, 5,000, and 7,000. I guess that was just based on how much demand there was for each, amount of faders and screens and so on. I don't know the exact decision behind that, but yeah, it messes with my OCD too that there's no 4,000. So the next step is third-party integration. So this one's pretty straightforward. So Q does not have a card slot on it. So if you wanted to integrate Q into like a Dante network or a Waves network, you theoretically can. You just need an intermediate hardware device to do that conversion. So if you wanted to really simplify things for the client and they needed Dante, you'd probably start with SQ, between SQ and AHM in that case, because all of those have card slots where you can add Dante or Waves or MADI, and the Dante card supports AES-67 on all of those. So if you do need to talk to other devices that use those protocols, then make sure, I would probably avoid Q if they need to integrate with a Dante network. But of course you can do that if that's what has to be done. And special feature requirements. So this is what I talked about, where certain consoles have specific features that the client might want. So you have to factor that in when making the decision. So Shure and Sennheiser wireless integration, that's something that's only available on Avantis and DLive. You don't have that on SQ. So if they want to be able to monitor battery levels and adjust gain on wireless mics, then make sure that they're choosing one of the consoles that has that access. Multiband compression dynamic EQ, that's not available on Q series. SQ, Avantis, and DLive all have that. MCAs, that's a DLive exclusive feature. That's basically a DCA for aux sends. So if you're a monitor engineer and you want to use DCAs for different auxes, that's an important feature. And so you have to make sure that they go with DLive in that case, so they have access to it. The main modes, if you've seen my class on main modes, we went through this. So LCR, LCR Plus, those are exclusive to DLive and Avantis. And the 5.1 main mode, which is very niche, so it's unlikely you'd ever encounter that, but that's exclusive to DLive. Granular user permissions and scene filtering. So as you advance from Q to SQ to Avantis to DLive, the scene filtering gets more and more granular, meaning that you could filter by very, very specific things. Like when I recall this scene, the only thing I want to change is the gate on channel 55. You can do that on DLive and Avantis, but you can't do that as granularly on SQ. And same with user permissions. They get a lot more sophisticated with DLive and Avantis versus SQ. So if you have different users and some need very limited access and some need very wide access, then make sure that you pick a console that can really, get into the weeds and narrow things down for them. Virtual soundcheck mode, you can accomplish virtual soundcheck with Q and SQ, but they don't have that dedicated mode that makes it really simple for the end user. So keep that in mind if somebody plans on using virtual soundcheck, like they're on a tour and they're going through different venues, make sure that they have access to that feature because it's super crucial. It also has a dedicated record send mode. So if you want to make records specific, like multi-track recordings specifically for virtual soundcheck, you can do that on DLive and Avantis using virtual soundcheck mode. Multi-track recording direct to USB. So this is the opposite. This is only available on Q and SQ, not available on DLive and Avantis. So if somebody does like these really remote recordings in the jungle and they need to do multi-tracks, then they can just bring along a USB drive and record straight to that. They'll probably need some kind of generator or something. But with a DLive or Avantis, doing multi-track recording involves, a Dante card or a Waves card or a MADI card, and then an external device to do the recording. It can be a lot simpler with SQ or Q. So that's something that the client might need, and that might limit your choices to Q and SQ. ABCD preamps, that's something only available on DLive. If somebody has, basically what that is an ability to quickly swap through different input sources for a particular channel. So if you have a band and the vocalists are constantly changing, you could have one vocalist come in and sing on a specific mic, and then you switch to B, and now it's the B input source of that channel. It's another vocalist that comes on, and they're going through the same channel strip, but the input source changes depending on who's singing. Or if their wireless mic goes out and you need to swap over quickly to another one, you could swap to B, and that will keep their whole channel strip again while switching over to a different input source from another mic. And that's only available on DLive right now. AES outputs. So you can, let's say you're feeding PA systems that mainly use AES. You can do that with a DX32 with AES output cards, or you can do it with a DX012. So I wouldn't go with a Q series mixer in that case because they can't talk to DX stage boxes. So you want to look at SQ on up in that case. And effects. So if somebody is in a school, I think I mentioned this example earlier, somebody's in a school and they occasionally might need like most of their needs are just kind of a single mic or two. So you might be thinking an AHM in that case, but then they say, oh, but sometimes we want to put like reverbs or delays on our vocalists. In that case, you want to maybe look at a console like Q or SQ because you'll have those effects built in, whereas with an AHM, you need an external device to run effects. So let's go through an example. So let's say there's a mid-sized venue and they're upgrading their audio console, and we've gone through all the questions with them, and this is what they said. They need 36 simultaneous channels as their maximum during their biggest performances. That's the most amount of mic inputs that they'll be mixing simultaneously. They need 10 stereo IM mixes for performers on stage. They all have their own IMs, and they want to have specific mixes for each of them. They can't share. They need front of house and monitor mix positions. So that's probably 2 consoles and occasional live stream. You might, if it's just occasional, if they only do it once or twice a year, you probably don't want to buy a dedicated console just for live streaming. Maybe we're thinking a tablet or a computer in that case to do that mixing. So we need a console that can handle that. 24 simultaneous faders accessible at once. They want it to be Dante capable to feed their new PA system that takes Dante inputs. And they had too much cabling before on their stage, too many XLRs running back to the console. They want a Cat6 stage box on stage. So to reduce their overall cabling, and they need standard reverb and delay effects. So if we think about the different series and which ones we can eliminate based on their answers, first of all, they said 36 simultaneous input channels. So that would probably eliminate Q series because it maxes out at 32 mono and 3 stereo. We're really pushing it, and it doesn't leave them much room for growth. So I'd probably just eliminate Q. And then 10 stereo IM mixes, that also eliminates Q, but SQ on up can handle that. They need front of house and monitor mix positions, plus occasional live stream. All of these consoles can still handle that. 24 faders, SQ6 and up can still do that. Dante, all the consoles can do that. Cat6 stage box, all of them can do that. And their reverb and delay effects, so we can eliminate AHM probably in that case. And so we're left between these 3. So now I would ask those remaining questions of what is your budget? What is the skill level of the typical user? If it's someone who's really familiar with digital consoles, they've used Allen and Heath platforms before, then you could start looking at Avantis and DLive. If they're really just getting started as just volunteers using it, you might want to look at SQ. And of course, availability. If one of those 3 is very much back ordered and it will take a long time for you to get it, then you might want to look at the other 2. It's just a matter of timing and what's currently available. But all of those consoles would meet their requirements theoretically. We could kind of think in our heads and brainstorm and solve their problems using these 3 consoles easily. So any questions about what we went over today? And you have to answer in the form of a question. Just a question in the form of a question.
No, I think you covered everything really well. My only question is this is Gilbert here. My only question is when you're doing Q and you're doing a digital split to like SQ or another Q, I always get confused on the limitations there. Like, and just briefly, what's the limitations there?
That's a great question, Gilbert. Yeah, when you're connecting a Q to a digital split, it has to be with SQ. That's the only one that's officially supported. So you can't connect a Q to another Q. And the reason for that is if you saw my clocking class, Gilbert, I don't think you attended that one. I don't remember. But the Q does not have an option to clock to an external device. It's always clocking internally. So when you connect a Q to another Q, they're both clocking internally, and that's going to cause all kinds of problems because they're not in sync with each other. So that's why you always have to connect a Q to an SQ, and you set the SQ to clock to the Q, which is always clocking internally. And you connect the D-Snake port of the Q to the S-Link port of the SQ. And then there's a document on the Allen and Heath website that shows exactly kind of which D-Snake channels align with which S-Link channels. But that's a really neat feature, and it's good to kind of make a very kind of entry-level, low-budget digital split with front of house and monitors. So you can really get an interesting system out of those two consoles.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Dayton, just an observation, looks like SQ6 and up. Forgot about HM. Yeah, so AHM it's kind of unique. It's there are certain situations like in a school auditorium, like I said, where an AHM would be great. It really depends on the client. I was kind of more focused on kind of actual like live music venues, I guess, in this masterclass. But there's a lot of opportunities to use AHM. But really, the question that I would ask is, do you need effects? And is the person using the console kind of familiar with digital consoles, or is it somebody who you just want to give very, very basic controls like an IP8? Would that be enough to accomplish all their mixing needs, or do they really want access to the screens and various controls? Looking into upgrading our gas. Interesting, Brian. I don't know what you mean by that. Are you going from...
Sorry, this is Brian.
Hey, Brian.
Hi. So I work for a small musical theater company, and we have 2 GLDs, and I hit enter and it sent gas.
Okay.
We're working with a local company to look into pricing for like an Avantis or a D-Live, and only once in the last 4 years have we used more than 64 channels. For when we did Mamma Mia. And so I was wondering, the idea that we were having is possibly 2 Avantises versus getting a D-Live. That way we always have a backup.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I used to work in tech support, and a lot of people didn't really think about that when they first made their installation. Like, we want to have a contingency plan. Like, Allen and Heath consoles are great, and they're very much rock solid, but no matter which company you go with, there's always the possibility of an issue. You know, buy the most expensive console in the world or the expensive car in the world, it's always going to have a possibility of there being a problem. So you want to have a contingency plan. So buying 2 of the same console for a digital split is always a great idea, because you can transfer the show file from one to the other and easily kind of consolidate things. Like if your front of house console has an issue, you could take the monitor console, put it at front of house, mix monitors from there as well, or from an iPad or something. So I think that's a really smart idea to go with 2 of the same console. 2 Avantis is a great option for that. If you very, very rarely go more than 64 channels, it depends how much you go over it, I would say. You could probably kind of make use of the processing of both consoles to kind of combine them to accomplish what you need to do. Or you can maybe kind of do some subgrouping, like in a submixer before you get into the console. If it's very rare that you do that, then that shouldn't be a problem. But if it starts happening more frequently and your venue's growing and you anticipate maybe going up more than 64 in the future, then you might want to leave room for growth and look at D-Live.
Okay. Yeah, what we've done in the past was we've actually had both GLDs at our front of house position and used one as a submix for the orchestra.
Oh, okay, yeah, there you go. Yeah, that would be my suggestion if you were stuck in that position. But yeah, I would leave room for growth. If you anticipate maxing out, you know, several times, then that could start to become a problem. But if it's very, very rare, then yeah, you should be fine with 2 Avantis in that case.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Anyone else have any
Brian,
questions?
do you mind if Brian, do you mind if I ask where you're located?
Oh, we're in Tigard, Oregon. So just outside of Portland.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, Dayton has a question. If you had 2 consoles, could you configure both as front of house and monitor? So if one goes down, you just switch. Yeah, you could do that with show files basically, because that's basically the full configuration of the console. So if, just like I was saying before, if you have the same console at both front of house and monitors, you can have the front of house and monitor show on the actual hard drive of both of them, and you could switch over as needed if there's ever an issue.